Good morning, class. This is, I guess, afternoon for you guys, but this is the introduction to tissues. I'm gone again, so I figured this would be easier. So while I'm talking, you guys can write down, and then if I'm still talking or if I get done talking, you can pause the video and you can finish writing down your slides. So hopefully this should be helpful, and you can even go back and watch it if you really want to study for your test. But we're going to be talking about tissues today. So tissues are groups of cells that kind of have the same function. They do about the same thing. Organs are made out of various types of tissues, all right? And these are kind of the building blocks for your body that kind of come together to do certain things, all right? So if you look at this picture up here, you can see that there's several different types of tissues here. So here's a type, here's a type, and then there's a type. Look down here. Here's a type of tissue, right? And then below it, there's a different type of tissue. So they kind of all kind of sit on top of each other. And we look at these tissues in lab, we'll really be able to see kind of the different layers and the boundaries, as it can be difficult because they are the same color because they're stained with the same materials, but they are different. They have certain characteristics, and we're going to talk about their characteristics today. Also keep in mind that it's not just humans and animals that have tissues, but plants have, and other multicellular organisms have tissues as well, like certain types of fungus, right? There's a lot of stuff you can look at with plant tissues. It's very, there's a lot you can spend with looking at the types of vascular and leaf tissues and all that stuff. So, but this is anatomy, so we're going to be focusing on humans. All right, so tissues are organized groups and layers of similar cells specialized to carry out a particular function. This function could be lining, protection. So like your skin is a lining tissue. All right, it's made up of, it's a lining tissue. It could also be contracting or causing movement. So for example, muscles, they cause movement of body parts or things within the body, for example. So there's four major types. They're all kind of divided into, there's more subdivisions of these four categories as well. So you have epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous tissue. Okay? Histology, this is the study of tissues, so it's not history, it's histology. This is the microscopic structure of tissues. This is, you can take a course in college about histology where you look at a lot of tissues, and a lot of the times when you talk about anatomy and physiology, you do talk about tissues because they are the building blocks of organs and other materials in the body. Okay? So very important, good place to start our anatomy journey. All right, so first major group of tissue, we're going to go more in depth, but I'm just going to kind of briefly talk about all four at the start. Epithelial tissue. This form protective covering and functions in secretion and absorption. All right. So this is the protective covering part is mostly your skin. Also, it lines the insides of like your mouth. There's a lot of epithelial tissue in your mouth. Protects like your organs, like for example, keeps your kidneys separate from your intestines. So it's epithelial tissues that kind of form boundaries. All right. It keeps things separated, which is a good thing in your body. And then it also functions in secretion and absorption. So secretion is like giving off secretions. So for example, sweat, that's a secretion that your body gives off, all right? Sweat glands are made primarily of epithelial tissue that release certain chemicals or mixtures, for example, sweat, onto your body or into certain ducts and glands and stuff like that. So for example, like sweat is a common one, like saliva, that's another one as well. All your glands, so your adrenal gland, your pituitary gland, all those guys, they are caused by the release of certain chemicals or mixtures of chemicals called secretions. Okay, so they function with that. And then lastly, absorption. So this is going to happen a lot in your small intestines. So your small intestines, they absorb certain foods and chemicals like sugars and proteins, and those get absorbed into your body, and then they're kind of dispersed into where they need to go. So a lot of your amino acids might end up in your muscles. Glucose maybe going to your brain because you need a lot of energy for your brain power. So that's what these guys do. Epithelial, the lining tissue. Epi means on top of, so the lining tissue. Connective tissue. There's a lot of different varieties of connective tissues. To me, it's kind of like you almost threw all the tissues that really didn't fit any of the other categories and you just threw them in here. Because you have a lot of different types of tissues here. All right, you got blood. All right. Blood is a type of connective tissue. You have adipose tissue, which is fat tissue. You have bone tissue. All right. You have some dense connective tissue, which is the stuff that your tendons are made out of and your ligaments. So it has a lot of variety, I would say. All right, but this kind of supports the softer body parts and binds structures together, so it holds things together. It keeps the kidneys in where they're supposed to be, keeps the heart where it's supposed to be. It keeps your knees attached to your body, keeps your arms attached, so it forms your tendons, ligaments, all that stuff. So it just holds everything together. It's kind of the glue that holds your body together. All right, and we're going to talk more about it. But a really interesting thing about connective tissue is that most of it is not cells. So this, if you look on this right here, this is some loose connective tissue. These little dots are cells. Everything else is not really cells. So they are kind of characterized by having probably a pretty small cell count. Like most everything else is something called matrix, and we'll talk about that. So, muscle tissues, these produce body movements. Misconception probably about muscle tissue is that it's not just your muscles, it's not just your biceps, it's not just your hamstrings. All right, it is a wide variety of different tissues in the body. So for example, your heart is pretty much just a giant muscle. It really is primarily muscle. Your small intestines, your blood vessels, they all have muscular layers that kind of move things throughout your body. So they're different types of muscles, but you are composed of many different types of muscles, and they are found everywhere in your body. So they produce body movements or movement of things in the body. So they produce movement. They're what they call a contractile tissue. So they respond and they can change their shape according to signals. Like for example, if you want to pick up a pencil, right, your muscles are going to contract and they're going to have some cellular things that are going on in those muscle cells, okay? So we'll talk more about these guys later too. Lastly is nervous tissue. They conduct nerve impulses that help control and coordinate body activities. This is probably the least common tissue in the body, but it's a very unique and a very important tissue because, you know, our brain is kind of what controls our body and makes sure that everything does what it's supposed to do, and that is your nervous tissue that's doing it. So this right here is one single neuron. They're very large structures, all right? And they basically send signals, and they kind of interpret signals from other neurons that then tell other body parts what to do. Like it's a neuron that's telling your fingers to write the notes that you're taking right now. It's these nervous tissue, these neurons that are actually doing it. But this is coordinating your body activities. It's not just you consciously doing things, but the very fact that your heart's beating, the very fact that you're breathing without having to think about it is due to this nervous tissue that is conducting these nerve impulses and are causing you to consciously do things in your body, whether it's conscious, whether you're thinking about it, or whether you're not. And that, I think that when we talk about the nervous system, it's one of my favorite systems because it's pretty complex, but we really don't understand a lot about it. There's still a lot we have to know, and I think that's really cool in science. So anyway. All right. So extracellular matrix. I've heard a couple of different words. Usually what I've heard is extracellular matrix. This is kind of how I've learned it. Sometimes you might just hear matrix. Sometimes you're going to hear intercellular substance. I'm going to try and use extracellular matrix, but just if you hear these other words, it kind of means the same thing. This is the stuff in between the tissues. All right, so you're in between the cells and in between the tissue. And it's technically non-living. A lot of the times it's not just empty space though. There's a lot of things that are going on in here. Okay, so it kind of is anchored down by certain things. So for example, these are some proteins that are holding these cells together, so they kind of almost form like the beams that hold your cells in certain shapes and structures. So that's really important for your cells, but they're technically not living. A lot of the cells actually create these proteins, and then they ship them out to the outsides of the cells. So they vary in form and function. So for example, your blood plasma, that's extracellular matrix of your blood. All right, that is very different than the extracellular matrix in like your tendons or your bone, right? So they all have different functions, and it depends on what the point of the tissue that it's in. All right, so form follows function. So what it looks like, its shape, determines its job. Okay. It supports the cells within the tissue that it resides in, so it kind of holds it together. It's like, I got your back, so you got your back, bro. So these guys are holding these proteins. This is the extracellular matrix here. They are holding these cells together. So there might be another cell over here, right? And it's holding and connecting these guys together. So it supports the tissue it's within. Very important stuff. And we'll talk more about this later, but there's a lot of actual biology and anatomy that happen, and physiology that happens in the extracellular matrix, and we don't always talk about it as much, especially because we spend a whole section in biology talking about the cell, and we don't really talk about this as much, but it's very, very important, especially when you look at tissues. So now we're going to start talking about epithelial tissues and its location. So they are widespread throughout the body. They cover organs, like for example, these are kidneys right here. It's epithelial tissue is going to line the outsides as well as the insides of these kidneys. All right, as well as these blood vessels right here, or whatever other tubes it's connected with. All right, it's going to cover organs, inner linings of body cavities, and lines hollow membranes. So for example, your most probably common one that you might think of is skin. All right, it's a pretty thick epithelial tissue. Most of them aren't that thick. Inside of your blood vessels, insides of your small intestines, your stomach, all that stuff, they're going to be lined with epithelial tissue. And all your glands as well, whether it's a sweat gland, whether it's an adrenal gland like adrenaline gland on top of your kidneys, all those guys, they are going to secrete things. So they're pretty much everywhere. Their structure, it forms linings. It's the lining tissue. It always has a free surface that is exposed to the outside or to an open internal space. All right. So basically, if you look at your skin, all right, we're going to spend the next chapter we're going to learn about is actually just the skin. It's a tegumentary system. But one side, this side, if you look at it right here, this is exposed to an open space. All right, now this, in the case of the skin, the open space is open air, right? It's the stuff that exposed to the open air. But it could be in other places in your body, like in your intestines, it's open to the inner tube that is your small intestines. That's the open area. It could be open to the blood or the blood vessels, right? Like in your blood vessels. So there's always one open free surface, okay? And then on the other side, there's something called a thin non-living layer. It's anchored to connective tissue, which is, remember, kind of more of the beams and the framework by a thin non-living layer called the basement membrane. So if you think about it, look at this guy right here. This is your skin layer. This is your epithelial part. All right. and it's connected to your connective tissue part, which is your dermis, by this basement membrane. You see this dark purple line? That is your basement membrane. Think of it as like living in the basement. It's down at the base, right? This is your basement membrane, and this is where how the epidermis, which is the lining tissue, is connected to the connective tissue, because the connective tissue holds everything together. All right, it's holding your body from falling apart, and these lining tissue kind of protect the connective tissue. So they kind of work hand in hand. They're buddies, and they meet at the basement membrane. Okay, it's pretty thin. It's in real life, you probably wouldn't be able to see it very well. At least it would be much smaller in this dark purple line. Its function. This tissue is tightly packed. Think of like a can of sardines, right? It's all packed in there, vacuum packed, vacuum sealed. It forms a protective barrier in structures such as the outer layer of the skin. Our skin is, that top layer that you see is pretty much all dead skin cells. All right, that's kind of packed on one another. All right, so they're packed in. All right, almost like shingles on a house. All right, and they protect the bottom layers that are more important, kind of, because you have a lot of epithelial tissue. It doesn't matter if one or two of them die, but a nervous tissue, you don't want that to die. It's a lot more. It requires your body to spend more energy. Other functions include secretion, so releasing things, releasing substances, absorbing, taking certain substances in, like glucose or salt or amino acids and proteins. Excretion, releasing things like salt, or like in sweat, and in sensory reception. So for example, you have certain neurons in like your skin, so you can kind of sense if there's something on your skin. All right. If it's a very hot stove, that would be a good thing for your body to know. Something's there. Some of their characteristics: they lack blood vessels. They do not have blood vessels. They have to be nourished from the underlying connective tissues, which have blood vessels. So like your skin, that top layer of your skin, it doesn't have any blood vessels. So all those cells are dead. And the farther you go from that basement membrane, and farther you go from the connective tissue, the more skin cells that are dead. So it has to get its nutrients, which comes from the blood vessels. When we think about the blood, I want you to think about it as like a highway. It's a highway that moves certain substances around. It transports things such as sugar, such as oxygen, and removes waste as well. So if you don't have easy access to a road, you're going to be struggling. And that's what a lot of the epithelial cells that are far away from the connective tissues, they eventually end up dying because they don't have these resources from blood. These cells readily divide. They do mitosis all day, every day. They be dividing. All right. They going crazy. It's pretty, like if you get a cut on your skin, it's healed in like a week, maybe like a paper cut or whatever. They can divide very rapidly, and it does not really have much long-term damage. All right. It's when scars kind of form when it's below this layer. So heals very rapidly and replaces lost or damaged ones. The cells in your stomach, I believe, are the fastest reproducing cell. I think that you get a new stomach lining every about 2 weeks, because that's how fast those stomach cells that line the inside of your stomach are replaced. What was it, that video that we watched the other day? It was saying that you lose about 2/3 of a kilogram in dead skin cells in a year. So they just be dividing. They're ready to mitosis. I think we're going to call it good for today. Make sure you get the notes in, and have a good day.